California versus Scott Peterson. We, the jury, in the above entitled cause, find the defendant, Scott Lee Peterson, guilty of the crime of murder of Lacey Denise Peterson.
You want to talk about the verdict first?
Wow, it was crazy. There was just like this amazing, horrible physical reaction that I had. Everything just went kind of silent, or I couldn't hear anything. I couldn't feel anything. I couldn't feel my feet on the floor. I couldn't feel the chair I was sitting in. My vision was even a little blurry. And I just had this weird sensation that I was falling forward and down, and there was going to be no end to this falling forward and down, like there was no floor to land on.
This office is where we keep everything related to Scott's case. We keep the trial transcripts. We keep the case discovery here. This board represents the details of the day. My name is Janie Peterson, and I am Scott and Lacey Peterson's sister-in-law. We're constantly evaluating the information we have from different perspectives. It's been 18 years, and there should be answers to questions. I think if people step back and look at the evidence in this case, they're going to see this crime isn't solved.
Hey, beautiful. I just left a message at home. 2:15. I live in Berkeley. I won't be able to get to Villa Farms to get that basket for Papa. I was hoping you would get this message and go on out there. I'll see you in a bit, sweetie. Love you. Bye.
Unlock the darkest stories and unravel the mysteries with Dark Crime Box. Subscribe now and step inside the world of true crime like never before.
Scott Peterson didn't walk into prison the way most men do. He didn't arrive loud, angry, or defiant. He arrived controlled, calm, almost careful. The same man the public had seen on television for years. Soft-spoken, measured, seemingly detached. Stepped behind the gates believing that restraint would be enough, that silence would protect him, that keeping his head down would allow him to disappear into the system. But prison is not a place where disappearing is possible. From the moment the doors closed behind him, Scott Peterson entered a world governed by a rule no judge ever explains, no sentencing document ever mentions, and no appeal can erase. A rule older than the buildings themselves. A rule enforced not by correctional officers, but by the men who live inside the walls. In prison, your crime is your identity. It doesn't matter how many times you say you're innocent. It doesn't matter how clean your record was before. It doesn't matter what your lawyers are arguing outside. Inside, there is one question that defines everything. What did you do? And Scott Peterson's answer carried a weight few inmates survive untouched. He was placed into protective custody almost immediately, not because he asked, because officials knew what would happen if they didn't. Men convicted of killing women, especially pregnant women, occupy the lowest rung of the prison hierarchy. They are not feared. They are hunted, sometimes quietly, sometimes violently, often patiently. Protective custody isn't protection in the way most people imagine. It's isolation disguised as safety. Smaller yards, limited movement, fewer programs. A constant reminder that you are separate, marked, watched. For Scott Peterson, this separation wasn't just physical. It was psychological. He had spent his life blending in, being liked, being perceived as normal. Prison stripped that away within days. Guards knew his name. Inmates whispered it. His face was familiar and not in a good way. High-profile inmates don't get anonymity. They get memory, and memory is dangerous. The rule he wasn't ready for revealed itself slowly. In prison, respect isn't given. It's tested. And the first test is honesty, not legal honesty, but prison honesty. You don't exaggerate your crime. You don't minimize it. You don't spin it. You say what you did, and you say it once. Because if your story changes even slightly, you're seen as weak. And weakness invites pressure. Scott Peterson didn't follow that rule. He never openly admitted guilt. Not in interviews, not in filings, not inside. He maintained his innocence carefully, consistently, but that consistency didn't help him. In prison culture, denial in a case like his isn't neutrality. It's provocation. Other inmates didn't see a man standing on principle. They saw someone refusing to own what they believed he had done. And in prison, refusing to own it is often interpreted as disrespect to the system, to other inmates, and to the unspoken code that governs survival. As days passed, the tension built in subtle ways. Meals eaten alone, yard time monitored closely, glances that lingered a second too long, silence that felt heavy rather than peaceful. Scott Peterson learned quickly that prison isn't loud all the time. Sometimes it's quiet right before something happens. He tried to adapt. He followed schedules. He avoided eye contact. He stayed within the rules written on paper. But the rule that mattered most wasn't written anywhere. Don't put yourself above the yard. Inmates noticed the way he carried himself, the way he spoke, the way he avoided details when conversations turned to crimes. To men serving decades for violence, that restraint felt calculated, as if he still believed he was different, still separate, still not subject to the same judgment. That perception alone was dangerous, because in prison, hierarchy is enforced socially before it's enforced physically. Rumors spread faster than fights. Labels stick faster than sentences. And once you're categorized, you don't get to redefine yourself. Scott Peterson had been categorized. The rule was clear to everyone but him. You don't control the narrative inside. The yard does. And as pressure mounted, it became clear that protective custody was not a long-term solution. Transfers followed. Facilities changed. But the rule followed him everywhere. His case preceded him. His reputation walked into rooms before he did. Halfway through his incarceration, as appeals continued outside and public debate reignited online, Scott Peterson remained trapped in a system that did not care about public opinion. Prison doesn't debate guilt. It enforces consequences. And somewhere between isolation and survival, Scott Peterson began to understand the truth too late. This wasn't about guards, or rules, or paperwork. It was about how inmates punish those they believe crossed an unforgivable line. Before we continue, take a moment to support Dark Crime Box by liking this video, sharing it, subscribing, and turning on notifications. The next chapter reveals exactly what happens when you break the most unforgiving rule behind bars, and why Scott Peterson could never undo that mistake. Because once prison decides who you are, there is no appeal. And in the end, the most dangerous sentence Scott Peterson ever received wasn't handed down in a courtroom. It was delivered quietly, by the men who would never let him forget what they believed he did. What do you think is more powerful, justice decided by the courts, or judgment enforced by those who live with you every day behind bars? What happens next is where the prison rule Scott Peterson wasn't ready for truly reveals itself. Inside prison, violence is not always the first weapon. Control is. Scott Peterson quickly learned that survival wasn't about strength or aggression. It was about positioning, about knowing where you stood in a social structure that changed by the hour. And the most dangerous mistake an inmate can make is misunderstanding their place. The rule was simple, brutal, and absolute. You never present yourself as morally superior. In prison culture, humility is survival. You don't act cleaner than others. You don't imply you're different. You don't suggest you don't belong there. The moment an inmate believes he's above the yard reminds him otherwise.
From prison,
Scott Peterson
answered a couple questions from the judge Tuesday.
He kept his distance.
And do we have your consent to appear via Zoom this morning?
Crimes. He maintained an almost clinical calm.
All right, thank you.
To the outside world, it looked like self-preservation. Inside, it looked like arrogance, like detachment, like someone refusing to acknowledge the shared reality everyone else had accepted. Other inmates weren't debating his innocence. They weren't following court filings or reading legal briefs. They saw a man convicted of killing his pregnant wife and unborn child who refused to speak plainly about it. To them, that silence wasn't dignity. It was denial. And denial in prison is read as disrespect. Slowly, Pressure replaced curiosity. It showed up in subtle ways. Commissary items going missing, exercise routines interrupted, seating disappearing at tables when he approached. These weren't random acts. They were messages, tests, opportunities for him to either adapt or escalate the situation without realizing it. And Scott Peterson didn't adapt. Protective custody limited physical danger, but it amplified social isolation. Being separated marked him further. It told the rest of the prison population that he was someone the system itself believed needed shielding, and that only reinforced the narrative that he couldn't face the consequences of his crime the way others had. Transfers between facilities didn't reset the clock. Each move carried his reputation forward. Guards knew his case. Inmates recognized his name. High-profile prisoners don't get fresh starts. They get repeated introductions to the same judgment. There were moments when tension nearly boiled over. Moments when proximity alone felt unsafe. Moments when his presence changed the energy of entire rooms. And through it all, Scott Peterson maintained the same posture. Quiet, withdrawn, controlled. But prison doesn't reward control. It rewards submission to the hierarchy. The men around him weren't asking for remorse in the way the public understands it. They wanted acknowledgement, ownership, an understanding that he knew exactly where he stood among them. And by refusing to give that, even silently, Scott Peterson remained a problem that never resolved. Appeals continued in the outside world. Legal arguments shifted. Sentences were adjusted. But none of that altered his daily reality. Prison doesn't update opinions based on court rulings. It remembers the original conviction and freezes it in place. Over time, Scott Peterson became a permanent fixture of tension. Not attacked, but never accepted. Not alone, but never safe. Existing in a narrow margin where one misstep could change everything. The rule he wasn't ready for had nothing to do with violence or loyalty or race. It was about humility, and Scott Peterson never truly learned how to give it. In the next chapter, we'll look at how this unspoken rule reshaped his entire prison existence, and why, for some inmates, life behind bars can be a harsher sentence than death itself. Before we go deeper, if you want Dark Crime Box to keep exposing what really happens after the headlines fade, support the channel by liking this video, sharing it, subscribing, and turning on notifications. What comes next explains why prison never stopped punishing Scott Peterson, even after the courts were done. By the time Scott Peterson had spent years inside, the rule he failed to understand had fully taken hold of his daily life. Prison wasn't waiting for him to learn it anymore. It was enforcing it. The punishment was not loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was constant. Scott Peterson lived in a state of controlled tension, where every day required awareness and restraint. Movement was calculated. Silence was deliberate. Routine became a shield. He learned when to step aside, when to remain invisible, and when to endure being watched without reacting. This wasn't discipline imposed by guards. It was pressure applied by the environment itself. The prison rule he broke had evolved into something deeper. You do not get to define yourself. Inside, identity is decided collectively. Once an inmate is labeled, that label becomes permanent. Scott Peterson was no longer a husband, no longer a salesman, no longer a man arguing innocence. He was a symbol, a reminder of a crime that stirred anger even among men serving life sentences for violence of their own. And symbols don't get relief. His isolation hardened over time. Protective housing limited contact, but it also ensured that his status never softened. Other inmates didn't need access to him to judge him. His name alone carried the weight. New inmates learned it quickly. Old ones never forgot it. This is where prison becomes something the public rarely sees. There is no closure inside. No moment when time served erases resentment. No expiration date on judgment. Scott Peterson's case didn't fade into history the way most do. It remained emotionally charged, tied to images that inmates couldn't separate from the person behind the bars. And prison has a long memory. Attempts to blend in failed repeatedly. Any effort to appear normal, to participate, to engage was filtered through the same lens. He wasn't allowed to be neutral. Neutrality itself was seen as resistance, as if acknowledging the yard's judgment would require something he refused to give. The rule demanded surrender of ego. Scott Peterson never surrendered it. Even as years passed and his death sentence was overturned, nothing improved inside. In fact, the reduction of his sentence altered nothing about how he was perceived. Prison doesn't care about legal technicalities. It cares about what it believes happened. And belief is stronger than law inside those walls. The irony was unavoidable. Outside, debates continued. Documentaries aired. Online forums argued evidence. Supporters questioned the verdict. But inside, none of that mattered. Scott Peterson's world was fixed, static, unforgiving. Every day was shaped by the same unspoken verdict delivered by men who would never review transcripts or watch courtroom footage. He existed in a permanent state of consequence. This is the part most people misunderstand about prison. The sentence doesn't end with time. It compounds. It reshapes identity. It strips away the illusion that silence or denial can protect you. And for someone like Scott Peterson, who built his life on appearing controlled and untouchable, prison dismantled him slowly. Not through violence, through permanence. Before we reach the conclusion, take a moment to support Dark Crime Box by liking, sharing, subscribing, and turning on notifications. The final chapter brings everything into focus and leaves us with a question no courtroom ever answers. Because in prison, the harshest punishment isn't what you lose. It's what you're never allowed to become again. By the time Scott Peterson settled into the long reality of life behind bars, the prison rule he wasn't ready for had already reshaped everything. Prison never asked him to confess in a courtroom sense. It demanded something else entirely, acceptance of his place. And that was something he never fully gave. Years passed, and nothing softened. Not time, not appeals, not the reduction of his sentence. Inside, his identity was frozen the moment he arrived. He remained a man defined not by who he claimed to be, but by what others believed he had done. Prison does not allow reinvention. It does not allow distance from the crime. Every day reinforces the same judgment, quietly and relentlessly. Scott Peterson lived in a narrow space between survival and isolation. Not attacked but never embraced. Not alone but never free from scrutiny. His world became smaller, more controlled, shaped by routine and restraint. The rule followed him everywhere. Humility is not optional and denial is not neutral. Outside the walls, debates continue. Inside, there is no debate. Prison has already decided. Before we close, support Dark Crime Box by liking this video, sharing it, subscribing, and turning on notifications. Your support keeps these untold chapters alive. And when all is said and done, the question remains. When justice is served by the courts, but judgment never ends inside prison walls, is the sentence ever truly over?